4:42 a.m. on September 29, 2021, an emergency call shattered the quiet of Katy, Texas. A trembling voice of a 17-year-old boy rang out, "I just killed my sister." But the story that followed was full of puzzling contradictions. Benjamin Elliott, a boy described by everyone as gentle and loving toward his family, claimed he had committed this horrifying act while sleepwalking. Was this the truth, or just an elaborate performance? Why would a teenager have a knife next to his bed? How could he call for help and perform CPR if he was truly in an unconscious state? Phone data showed that Benjamin had used his device just 20 minutes before the incident, even turning off his school alarm. Does this align with sleepwalking? Medical experts reached completely opposing conclusions about the scientific validity of the sleepwalking defense. In this battle between science and law, between compassion and justice, one big question still lingers. Was Benjamin Elliott truly the victim of a rare medical phenomenon? Or was he the perpetrator who carefully calculated the murder of his twin sister? In the quietest hours of late night, when the city of Katy, Texas was immersed in peaceful sleep, a phone call would tear that tranquility apart forever. It was at 4:42 a.m. on September 29, 2021, when the emergency dispatcher at Fairfax County picked up the phone and heard the trembling voice of a 17-year-old boy. Benjamin Elliott, with a voice full of terror but strangely calm, uttered words that would forever haunt those who heard them. He had just taken the life of his twin sister. This statement was not merely a confession of guilt, but opened one of the most mysterious and controversial cases in American legal history. A story about the fragile boundary between dreams and reality, between consciousness and unconsciousness. The emergency dispatcher, trained to handle every crisis situation, still couldn't hide the shock in their voice while trying to understand the situation. Benjamin continued with a voice full of desperation, saying he thought it was just a dream, but then realized it was cruel reality. While this conversation unfolded over the phone line, on the other side, a family once considered perfect was breaking into pieces. The Elliott house on Brown Meadow Court, once a symbol of American family happiness, had now become the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. Megan Elliott, a 17-year-old girl with bright eyes and a warm smile, lay unconscious on the small bed in her bedroom. A deep wound on her neck was bleeding continuously, while Benjamin, her twin brother, was trying to perform CPR following instructions from the dispatcher. This scene, described in detail in the case files, would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the legal debate that followed. Benjamin's supporters would point out that this was the action of a brother desperately trying to save his sister, not of a cold-blooded killer who had just taken a victim's life. However, skeptics questioned whether this was an elaborate performance carefully staged to cover up the crime. Benjamin's hands were covered in blood as he performed continuous chest compressions, his eyes red with tears. His voice trembled as he reported the situation to emergency services, repeatedly stating that Megan was still alive but very weak. In the background of the call, you could hear Benjamin's heavy breathing and sounds from his desperate rescue efforts. Not long after the call began, Michael Elliott, the father of the two children, was awakened by unusual noise in the house. He ran downstairs with worry, not knowing that he was about to witness the worst scene any father could imagine. When Michael entered Megan's room, he saw his son kneeling beside his daughter's bed, trying to save his sister's life. Megan's face, as Michael later described in his tearful testimony in court, had turned gray, a small but haunting detail that would follow him for the rest of his life. Kathy Elliott's anguished screams echoed throughout the house as she followed her husband downstairs and witnessed the horror. The mother, who worked for the Girl Scouts of America organization and had always been proud of her happy family, now had to face the cruel reality that no parent ever wants to experience. Her beloved daughter was dying, and her son, the boy once considered the perfect older brother, was the very cause of this tragedy. Throughout the emergency call lasting more than 10 minutes, the dispatcher guided the Elliott family through basic emergency procedures. Michael and Kathy Elliott, despite being in severe shock, still desperately tried to follow the instructions. They took turns performing chest compressions on Megan, counting each beat according to the emergency operator's guidance, hoping for a miracle that could save their daughter's life. Meanwhile, Benjamin remained nearby, still in a state of panic and confusion. He kept repeating that it was all just a dream, and then it wasn't, as if his brain couldn't accept the reality unfolding. These words, recorded in the emergency call audio, would become the center of legal debates that would last for years to come. Harris County emergency personnel arrived at the scene within minutes of the call. They quickly took over the rescue efforts from the Elliott family, using professional medical equipment and the most advanced techniques. However, despite all efforts, Megan's condition was too critical. The wound on her neck had caused too much blood loss, and vital organs were no longer functioning. Megan Elliott was officially pronounced dead at the scene at 5:00 a.m. Megan's death was not only the tragic end of a young life full of potential, but also the beginning of a complex story about crime, science, and justice. This 17-year-old girl, described by friends and family as a talented artist with a creative view of the world, had become the victim of a case that would challenge all conventional understanding of human consciousness and legal responsibility. Immediately after medical personnel declared Megan deceased, Benjamin was taken out of the house and handcuffed. Harris County Police, following standard procedure in serious cases, considered Benjamin the primary suspect and proceeded with his arrest. The 17-year-old was placed in a police car and sat there for 3 hours in the cold Texas night rain, continuously whispering words like, "It was just a dream and then it wasn't." Benjamin's presence in the police car, with behaviors completely unlike the image of a cold-blooded killer, created the first questions in the minds of law enforcement officers. He didn't try to flee, didn't attempt to hide his guilt, and had even proactively called for help. These behaviors didn't fit the typical profile of a premeditated criminal. While Benjamin sat in the police car, the Harris County Crime Scene Investigation Team began the meticulous work of evidence collection. Megan's bedroom was sealed off and became the focus of the investigation. Forensic experts conducted preliminary examinations at the scene, documenting every detail that could have value for the case. The first and most important discovery was the knife found near Megan's bed. This was a U.S. Air Force survival knife, owned by Michael Elliott from his time serving in the military. This type of knife, with its sharp blade and sturdy design, was not a common item that a teenager would have in their bedroom. This immediately raised questions about whether Benjamin had planned ahead. According to Michael Elliott's testimony, Benjamin had long shown an obsession with knives and survival tools. The boy frequently studied survival techniques in nature and had a hobby of collecting various types of knives. However, how the knife came to be in Benjamin's hands on that fateful night remained a mystery that needed to be solved. The autopsy conducted that very morning revealed important details about the nature of the wounds. Megan had been stabbed twice in the neck area, with the main wound being 4 inches deep and completely severing both the carotid artery and jugular vein. These were the most important blood vessels supplying blood to the brain, and their severance led to the victim's rapid death. The most notable aspect of the forensic report was the terrifying precision of the stab wounds. These were not random wounds or those caused by panic, but showed a suspicious level of precision. This increased investigators' suspicions about whether this was truly the action of someone in an unconscious state. However, there was one detail at the scene that puzzled forensic experts. With the type of wounds Megan had sustained, especially the severing of major blood vessels, there should have been blood spatter scattered on walls and surrounding surfaces. However, the blood pattern at the scene didn't show this. Instead, most of the blood was found on the pillow that Benjamin said he had used to stop his sister's bleeding. This anomaly created 2 completely opposing theories. The defense would argue that this was evidence showing Benjamin had truly tried to save his sister immediately after realizing what had happened. Meanwhile, the prosecution would put forth the theory that the pillow had been used to cover the victim's face, not to stop bleeding, but to prevent cries for help. When the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Harris County Police Department, Benjamin Elliott was led into a small, cold interrogation room with gray walls and a simple metal table. This was where truths were exposed, where lies were unmasked, and perhaps where a 17-year-old would have to face the consequences of what had happened just hours before. Detective Freder Munoz, a veteran with more than 20 years of experience investigating serious crimes, entered the room with keen, observant eyes. He had interrogated hundreds of suspects, from hardened criminals to innocent people caught in difficult circumstances. However, this case was somehow different. Sitting before him was a teenage boy who appeared normal, showing no signs of being a dangerous criminal. Benjamin sat in the hard chair, hands placed on the table, eyes looking down at the floor. Despite having just experienced a horrific night, he maintained a surprisingly calm composure. There were no tremors or signs of panic that Detective Munoz usually saw in newly arrested suspects. Instead, Benjamin displayed a strange tranquility, as if he were living in another world, distant from the cruel reality surrounding him. The interrogation began with routine questions about personal background and family circumstances. Benjamin answered cooperatively, his voice soft but clear. He spoke about daily life with his family, about his close relationship with Megan, and about future plans that had now turned to smoke. However, when Detective Munoz shifted to questions about the night's events, Benjamin's reaction became noteworthy. Instead of showing pain or remorse as a normal person would when recounting taking the life of a loved one, Benjamin described the events as if he were telling about a strange dream. He asked Detective Munoz a haunting question. Have you ever had a realistic nightmare where everything seemed real? This question, recorded in the interrogation audio, would become one of the most important pieces of evidence for Benjamin's defense argument. Benjamin continued, saying that the last thing he remembered before everything happened was the sensation of stabbing something. He described, "I was in her room and I turned on the light. I was panicking." These words, which at first sounded like a guilty person's confession, actually showed confusion and lack of clear understanding about what had transpired. However, what made Detective Munoz and other investigators uneasy was not the content of these statements, but the way Benjamin presented them. His strange calmness, lacking the natural emotional responses that someone who had just experienced trauma would have, created the first doubts in the investigation team's minds. The most notable aspect of the interrogation wasn't what Benjamin said about the incident, but how he redirected the conversation. Instead of focusing on the tragedy that had just occurred, Benjamin began discussing his academic plans, the upcoming SAT exam, and the colleges he wanted to apply to. This topic shift, seemingly casual but actually quite conscious, made investigators question the authenticity of the grief Benjamin was displaying. Detective Munoz, with his extensive experience, recognized this could be a psychological defense mechanism, where Benjamin was trying to avoid facing the cruel reality. However, he couldn't ignore the possibility that this was a carefully calculated performance by an intelligent criminal. The key question he had to answer was Benjamin truly a victim of a rare medical phenomenon, or was he just a talented actor trying to escape the consequences of his crime? While the interrogation was taking place at the police station at the crime scene, the Harris County Forensic Science Team was conducting the most meticulous examination. They knew that every small detail, every overlooked trace, could be the key to illuminating the truth about what had happened in that small bedroom. Forensic experts collected a series of important physical evidence. The Air Force survival knife, still stained with blood, was carefully packaged and sent to the laboratory for DNA and fingerprint analysis. The leather knife sheath found nearby was also seized as an important clue that could reveal the perpetrator's intent and planning. The investigation team took blood samples from various locations throughout the house, from the entrance wall, from Megan's bedroom, and from the living room. This blood distribution pattern would help experts reconstruct the sequence of events and possibly determine whether any struggle had taken place. However, initial results showed no signs of a struggle, which only added to the mystery of the case. The pillow that Benjamin claimed to have used to stop Megan's bleeding became one of the most disputed pieces of evidence. Forensic experts conducted thorough analysis to determine whether the blood pattern on the pillow was consistent with stopping bleeding or showed other signs. Initial results showed the pillow had absorbed a lot of blood, but determining the exact purpose of use would require more specialized analysis. While physical evidence was being collected and analyzed, another important discovery was made: Benjamin's cell phone. This device, which could contain crucial information about his activities before and during the incident, was confiscated for data analysis. Digital forensics experts would need time to extract and analyze all the data, but initial findings revealed notable details. Data from Benjamin's phone showed he had used the device until about 20 minutes before calling for help. This meant Benjamin had been alert and conscious at least 20 minutes before the incident occurred. Moreover, the step-counting app on the phone recorded his movement from his room to Megan's room, and then back to his room to get the phone and call for help. This data was particularly important because it directly contradicted Benjamin's claim that he was in an unconscious or sleepwalking state when the incident occurred. If someone was truly sleepwalking, could they perform complex actions like using a smartphone? This would become one of the central questions of the entire case. Additionally, phone data also showed that Benjamin had turned off his school alarm before moving to Megan's room. This action, though small, demonstrated a level of consciousness and forward thinking that was inconsistent with a sleepwalking state. Sleepwalkers typically perform simple and repetitive actions, not conscious decisions like turning off alarms to avoid making noise. There was a 24-minute gap in Benjamin's phone activity history, from the last use until he called for help. This time period, according to the defense argument, was when Benjamin was in a sleepwalking state and had no awareness of his actions. However, the prosecution argued this could be the time when Benjamin intentionally turned off his phone to avoid leaving traces of his plan. While phone data was being analyzed, the investigation team also began the most difficult search in any case: motive. Why would Benjamin, a teenager described by everyone as gentle and loving toward his family, take the life of his twin sister with whom he had been so close? This question would haunt investigators throughout the investigation process. An extensive survey of the relationship between Benjamin and Megan was conducted meticulously. Police examined all messages exchanged between the siblings in the week before the incident, hoping to find any signs of conflict or tension. They also reviewed both their social media accounts, searching for posts or comments that might reveal their mood or relationship. The results of this investigation surprised everyone. There were no signs of discord between Benjamin and Megan. On the contrary, all evidence pointed to an extremely close relationship between the twin siblings. The messages between them were full of affection and mutual care, with no signs of jealousy, competition, or conflict. Interviews with friends, teachers, and neighbors yielded similar results. Everyone described Benjamin and Megan as a perfect twin pair, always beside each other and protecting one another. Drew Whitaker, a longtime family friend of the Elliots, shared, "They were so close. You could never imagine anything bad happening between them." Megan was described as someone who always sought out Benjamin when feeling uncomfortable, and Benjamin was known as a protective older brother. The failure to find a clear motive created a major challenge for the investigation team. In most cases, motive is the key to understanding why a crime is committed. Its absence in this case forced investigators to consider other possibilities, including that Benjamin might actually be telling the truth about his sleepwalking state. During deeper investigation into Benjamin's medical and psychological history, important information was discovered. He had a history of sleepwalking since childhood. Elizabeth Elliott, Benjamin and Megan's older sister, provided testimony about an incident that occurred years earlier when she witnessed Benjamin appearing at a bedroom door in what seemed to be a sleepwalking state. He didn't respond when called by name and only returned to his room when physically touched on the shoulder. There was an even more interesting story from one of Benjamin's friends. During a sleepover years ago, friends had found Benjamin sitting on the couch, eating a donut while still asleep. When they woke him up, Benjamin appeared surprised and confused, remembering nothing about what he had done. This story, though seemingly harmless, was important evidence showing that Benjamin truly had the ability to perform complex actions while still asleep. Even more notable was that the Elliott family had a genetic history of sleepwalking. Kathy Elliott's uncle was known to have had sleepwalking episodes during adolescence, during which he would go to the garage and use tools while still asleep. One of her aunts also had a similar history, once walking out of the house while asleep. This information provided important medical context that could explain what had happened with Benjamin. After 18 months of thorough investigation, in April 2023, the Harris County Grand Jury made the decision to indict Benjamin Elliott on charges of first-degree murder. This decision was not easy, especially given the lack of clear motive and evidence supporting the possibility of sleepwalking. However, circumstantial evidence, particularly phone data and the nature of the wounds, convinced the grand jury that there was sufficient basis to bring the case to trial. In a modern building at the Houston Medical Center, where fluorescent lights illuminated pristine white corridors, Dr. Gerald Simmons sat in his office at the Comprehensive Sleep Medicine Center, contemplating an unusual consultation request that had just come to him. With more than 30 years of experience in neurology and sleep disorders, he had witnessed the strangest phenomena of the human brain during sleep. However, the Benjamin Elliott case presented an entirely different challenge. When Benjamin's defense team first contacted Dr. Simmons, his initial reaction was deep skepticism. He had heard too many stories about criminals trying to use sleep disorders as an excuse to escape legal responsibility. In the mind of a serious scientist like him, the idea that a teenager could take his sister's life while sleepwalking sounded more like fiction than medical reality. Dr. Simmons recalled the first moment he was approached about this case. He had wondered whether he really wanted to get involved in a case that could damage his professional reputation. The next question in his mind was, if he refused, who else in the sleep medicine community could handle such a complex case? As one of the leading experts on parasomnia, he realized he had a scientific responsibility to seek the truth, regardless of what conclusions it might lead to. Dr. Simmons's final decision was to agree to meet Benjamin, but with one clear condition. He would approach this case as a scientist, without bias toward any side, and would only draw conclusions based on solid medical evidence. He knew that his professional reputation would depend on the accuracy and objectivity of these findings. The first meeting between Dr. Simmons and Benjamin Elliott took place in a small room at the medical center, with the defense legal team present. He had prepared a long list of questions to assess medical history, sleep disorder symptoms, and the possibility that Benjamin truly had parasomnia. However, what he discovered in this interview began to change his initial perspective on the case. Benjamin told Dr. Simmons about his strange sleep experiences since childhood. He described times of waking up in places other than where he went to sleep, vague memories of performing actions he didn't remember doing, and especially difficulty waking up and maintaining full alertness after sleep. These descriptions weren't like what an ordinary person would know about sleepwalking from popular sources, but showed deep understanding of the actual symptoms of this disorder. What was particularly important in the interview was when Benjamin described his feelings on the night the incident occurred. He didn't simply say he was asleep, but described a very special state of consciousness, a feeling like living in a dream but also having moments of alertness. He said he remembered the sensation of stabbing something, but only became fully aware when he realized he was in Megan's room and his sister was seriously injured. This description was completely consistent with what Dr. Simmons knew about confused arousal, a form of parasomnia in which patients can perform complex actions while the brain is not yet fully alert. In this state, different parts of the brain can be at different levels of alertness, creating a very strange experience of consciousness. After the initial interview, Dr. Simmons decided to conduct specialized scientific studies to determine whether Benjamin truly had the physiological characteristics necessary for violent parasomnia to occur. He knew that to reach an accurate scientific conclusion, he needed objective, indisputable data. The first sleep study was conducted in Dr. Simmons's laboratory on a night in October 2022. Benjamin was brought to the lab at 8 in the evening, and the preparation process for the study took nearly 2 hours. He was connected to dozens of electrodes placed on his head, face, chest, and limbs, each electrode monitoring a different aspect of brain and body activity during sleep. The monitoring equipment included electroencephalography to track brain waves, electrooculography to monitor eye movements, electromyography to measure muscle activity, and sensors to monitor heart rate, blood pressure, and blood oxygen. Additionally, infrared cameras were used to record all of Benjamin's movements throughout the night, creating a complete video record of his sleep behavior. The results of the first sleep study surprised Dr. Simmons about the severity of the problems Benjamin was experiencing. The data showed he fell into slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage of sleep, within just 11 minutes after turning off the lights. This was a very fast rate, showing Benjamin had very high sleep pressure, meaning his body had a stronger need for sleep than normal. More importantly, the study discovered that Benjamin suffered from severe sleep apnea. Throughout the night, his airway was partially blocked hundreds of times, each lasting from 10 to 30 seconds. These breathing interruptions not only reduced sleep quality, but also created continuous microarousals, in which brain activity suddenly increased, then returned to deep sleep. Dr. Simmons explained that these sleep apnea episodes could function as a trigger for parasomnia episodes. When the brain is disturbed by oxygen deprivation, it can produce abnormal reactions, in which some parts of the brain wake up while other parts remain asleep. This mixed consciousness state is precisely the necessary condition for sleepwalking and other abnormal sleep behaviors to occur. To ensure the accuracy of these findings, Dr. Simmons decided to conduct a second sleep study after 6 weeks. He wanted to see whether the abnormal patterns he had observed would repeat, and whether he could record any actual sleepwalking episodes. The second study yielded even more convincing results. Not only did it confirm the findings from the first time, but this time Dr. Simmons actually recorded a sleepwalking episode of Benjamin. Video footage showed him sitting up in bed, eyes open, but showing no signs of normal consciousness, and performing some movements that seemed purposeful, but were actually very repetitive and automatic. What was particularly important in this video was how Benjamin reacted when researchers tried to interact with him. He didn't respond to voices, didn't recognize the presence of other people, and seemed to be living in a completely different world. When guided back to bed, he complied mechanically, with no signs that he clearly understood what was happening around him. Based on this data, Dr. Simmons developed a theory he called the perfect storm theory to explain what might have happened on that fateful night. According to this theory, a combination of multiple factors created perfect conditions for a violent parasomnia episode. The first factor was chronic sleep deprivation that Benjamin was experiencing. Like many teenagers, he didn't have a regular sleep schedule and was frequently sleep deprived. This created an accumulated sleep debt, causing his brain to tend to fall into deep sleep more quickly and powerfully than normal. The second factor was the obstructive sleep apnea that the studies had discovered. The continuous breathing interruptions during the night not only fragmented sleep, but also created stress hormones that could affect brain chemistry. When combined with sleep deprivation, this created a very unstable brain state, prone to abnormal episodes. The third factor, and possibly the most important, was genetic predisposition. Benjamin's family history showed that many other members had experienced sleepwalking. This suggested he might carry genes that increased the risk of parasomnia, especially under conditions of stress or sleep disruption. The final factor in the perfect storm was the presence of the knife. Dr. Simmons explained that in a sleepwalking state, people tend to perform familiar behaviors or behaviors related to objects they frequently interact with. Benjamin's interest in knives and survival tools may have created a strong motor memory, causing him to automatically reach for and use the knife in an altered consciousness state. When all these factors combined on the same night, sleep deprivation, sleep apnea episodes, genetic vulnerability, and proximity of a familiar weapon, they created conditions for a parasomnia episode that could lead to violence. Dr. Simmons emphasized that this was not an excuse or justification, but a scientific explanation of what might have happened. After completing the studies and analysis, Dr. Simmons reached a conclusion that even he found hard to believe. Benjamin Elliott had truly taken his sister's life in a parasomnia state. He stated clearly that Benjamin had certainly been the one to commit this act. There was no doubt about that. But he had done this in an altered consciousness state, without clear intent or motivation. This conclusion caused a major shock in the Elliott family. Michael and Katy Elliott, who had already endured losing their daughter and seeing their son accused, now had to face an even more terrifying truth. The fact that their son could commit violence during sleep meant that anyone with sleep disorders could face a similar situation. Katy Elliott shared her feeling of fear when she said this was as scary as hell. She realized that if this could happen to their family, it could happen to anyone with sleep problems. This was not just a family tragedy, but also a warning about the hidden dangers of untreated sleep disorders. The Elliott family had hoped that Dr. Simmons' findings would convince prosecutors to drop charges against Benjamin. They believed that when science proved this was a medical episode rather than criminal intent, the justice system would recognize that Benjamin needed treatment rather than punishment. However, they had underestimated the complexity of the legal system and the determination of the prosecution team. To understand the context of Benjamin Elliott's case, one must look at the history of sleepwalking defense in law. Using parasomnia as a criminal defense was not new, and there had been many precedent cases in the past with very different results. One of the most famous cases was Kenneth Parks in Canada in 1987. Parks had driven more than 20 kilometers at night to his in-laws' house and killed his mother-in-law with a knife. He claimed he had done all this while sleepwalking, and remarkably, the jury believed this defense and acquitted him. Another case was Albert Tyrrell in 1846, considered the first time sleepwalking defense was used in American courts. Tyrrell was accused of killing his mistress, but his lawyer argued that he might have done this while sleepwalking. The jury ultimately acquitted Tyrrell, creating precedent for future cases. However, not all sleepwalking defenses were successful. There were many cases where defendants tried to use this strategy but failed to convince juries. Raymond Lazarine in Harris County in 2019 was a recent example. Lazarine claimed he had shot his wife while sleepwalking, but prosecution successfully argued that evidence didn't support this defense, and he was convicted. The important thing to understand about sleepwalking defense is that it's not simply a matter of having sleepwalking history or not. Courts need to see compelling scientific evidence that the defendant was truly in an altered state of consciousness at the time the crime was committed. The burden of proof is very high, and prosecution often has their own expert witnesses to challenge defense claims. In Benjamin Elliott's case, the prosecution team realized from the beginning that they would face a formidable scientific defense. Prosecutor Megan Long, with her experience handling previous sleepwalking cases, understood that relying solely on motive and circumstantial evidence wouldn't be enough. She needed to challenge Dr. Simmons' scientific findings with equivalent science. Long recruited Dr. Mark Pressman, another expert in the field of sleep medicine, to review the case and provide counter-analysis. Dr. Pressman, with credentials equivalent to Dr. Simmons, approached the case from a more skeptical perspective. He examined the same data and evidence but reached completely different conclusions. According to Dr. Pressman, the behaviors Benjamin demonstrated after the incident, calling emergency services, performing CPR, and interacting coherently with first responders, showed a level of consciousness inconsistent with a true sleepwalking state. He argued that someone in a parasomnia state wouldn't have the ability to perform such complex, goal-directed behaviors. Additionally, Dr. Pressman pointed out that phone data showing Benjamin was active before the incident was also inconsistent with the idea that he had transitioned into a sleepwalking state. He argued that transition from wakefulness to sleepwalking typically requires a period of deep sleep, and the timeline in this case didn't support this theory. This battle of experts set the stage for a legal confrontation that would test the limits of scientific knowledge about consciousness and legal responsibility. Two distinguished scientists, with the same qualifications and access to the same data, had reached completely opposite conclusions. The question now was, whom would the jury believe, and how could the justice system navigate these scientific uncertainties to reach a fair verdict? On the morning of February 18, 2025, Harris County Courthouse witnessed the beginning of one of the most controversial trials in local judicial history. The 182nd Criminal District Court, presided over by Judge Danilo Lacayo, had become the stage for a confrontation between science and law, between compassion and justice, between what we understand about human consciousness and what society demands from the justice system. The jury selection process had taken place over several days, with special care from both sides. Both the prosecution and defense teams understood that their success would depend on finding jurors who could understand and evaluate the complex scientific evidence they were about to present. This was not an ordinary case with clear motives and simple evidence, but a challenge requiring the jury to consider advanced medical concepts and philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness. Prosecutors Megan Long and Maroon Kutani sought jurors who could accept the idea that sometimes in the justice system, we may never fully know why a crime is committed. They needed people who could focus on circumstantial evidence rather than demanding a clear motive. Meanwhile, the defense team led by Carrie Hart and Wes Rucker looked for jurors with open minds toward medical science and who could understand the complexity of sleep disorders. When the trial officially began, a surprising decision was made by the defense team. They waived their right to deliver an opening statement. This was a bold tactic, allowing the prosecution to lead the narrative from the start and create the first impression with the jury. However, this also meant the defense would face greater pressure in refuting the arguments the prosecution would present. Prosecutor Maroon Kutani opened the trial with an emotional portrait of Megan Elliott's final moments. He described the 17-year-old girl's last memory as being jolted from peaceful sleep, seeing her brother standing over her with a knife plunged into her neck and a pillow covering her face. These images, presented with powerful language, created an emotional framework that the prosecution hoped would influence the jury's emotions throughout the trial. The prosecution's main strategy was built on a theory they called premeditation through circumstantial evidence. Megan Long argued that while they couldn't provide a clear motive, they could prove Benjamin had planned ahead through a series of conscious actions. She emphasized that Benjamin obtaining the knife the night before and using that same knife to take his sister's life could not be a coincidence. The most important evidence the prosecution presented was data from Benjamin's cell phone. Digital forensics experts had extracted a detailed timeline showing Benjamin had used his phone until 20 minutes before calling for help. More importantly, the step-counting app on his phone had precisely recorded his movements from Benjamin's room to Megan's room and back. This data, according to the prosecution, proved that Benjamin had been fully alert and conscious throughout the commission of the crime. Additionally, the data also showed Benjamin had turned off his school alarm before moving to his sister's room. This action, though seemingly small, demonstrated a level of forward thinking and consciousness inconsistent with a sleepwalking state. The prosecution argued that someone sleepwalking wouldn't have the ability to make such calculated decisions. The prosecution's key witness was Dr. Mark Pressman, an expert in psychology and sleep medicine. Dr. Pressman offered an analysis completely different from Dr. Simmons's findings. He argued that Benjamin had shown clear memory of the incident, which was inconsistent with a true sleepwalking state. Furthermore, Benjamin's ability to exit the alleged altered state and perform CPR, call for help coherently, showed a level of consciousness much higher than what a sleepwalker could achieve. Dr. Pressman also challenged the timeline the defense had presented. He argued that the transition from a fully conscious state to deep sleepwalking typically requires an extended period of sleep, and evidence showed Benjamin had been active on his phone just minutes before the incident. According to scientific understanding of sleep cycles, a person's ability to shift from wakefulness to complex sleepwalking behavior in such a short time was extremely unlikely. One of the most dramatic moments of the prosecution's case was when they asked Michael Elliott to identify his daughter's body through autopsy photos. This was an emotional manipulation tactic designed to remind the jury of the human cost of the crime. When Michael Elliott looked at the photos and confirmed it was Megan, the tears in his eyes and his broken voice created an emotional atmosphere in the courtroom. The prosecution also presented detailed forensic analysis of the wounds Megan had suffered. The 2 neck wounds, with the main wound 4 inches deep and cutting through major arteries, were analyzed to show the precision and force involved. They argued that this type of wound required a level of intentionality and control inconsistent with the random actions of a sleepwalker. However, the biggest controversy of the prosecution's case centered around the interpretation of blood evidence, particularly the absence of blood spatter patterns at the crime scene. With the type of wounds Megan sustained, especially with major arteries being severed, forensic experts would typically expect to see blood spray patterns on walls and surrounding surfaces. The absence of these patterns led the prosecution to a dark theory. The pillow had been used to muffle the victim's screams rather than to stop bleeding, as Benjamin claimed. Megan Long presented this theory with conviction, arguing that the only way there would be no blood spatter was if the pillow had been placed over the wound at the exact moment the knife was withdrawn. She suggested that Benjamin had calculated this action to prevent Megan from screaming and alerting their parents, while also minimizing blood evidence that could complicate his planned story. The defense team, recognizing the danger of the prosecution's momentum, launched a counterattack focused entirely on the scientific evidence of parasomnia. Wes Rucker, lead defense attorney, directly addressed what he called the elephant in the room, the question of whether the sleepwalking defense was a legitimate medical explanation or just a creative legal strategy. He firmly stated that this was absolutely not a made-up defense and backed up this claim with extensive research data on parasomnia episodes. Rucker presented scientific literature showing that parasomnia could occur shortly after falling asleep and could result in sudden, violent events characterized by lack of motive and no attempt to cover up actions. He emphasized that this was not a ruse or attempt to get Benjamin off, but a tragic set of circumstances backed by solid medical science. The defense's star witness was Dr. Gerald Simmons, who brought his extensive credibility as a neurologist and sleep disorder specialist. Dr. Simmons presented a detailed explanation of the sleep studies he had conducted with Benjamin, including video evidence of actual sleepwalking episodes. His testimony methodically walked through the science behind the perfect storm theory, explaining how the combination of sleep deprivation, sleep apnea, genetic predisposition, and weapon proximity had created conditions for violent parasomnia. The most powerful moment of Simmons's testimony was when he definitively stated his conclusion. Benjamin had definitely taken his sister's life. There was no doubt that he had held the knife and stabbed her, but he had not done this voluntarily and had no motivation. This was the moment the defense team had built their entire strategy around: acknowledgement of factual guilt combined with a medical explanation that could negate criminal responsibility. Family testimony provided crucial support for the defense narrative. Elizabeth Elliott, testifying via video call from Georgia, recalled a childhood episode in which she had witnessed Benjamin sleepwalking. She described how he appeared in a bedroom doorway, unresponsive to calls of his name, and only returned to bed when physically guided. A great-aunt also testified about the family history of sleepwalking, establishing the genetic component that Dr. Simmons had referenced. Michael Elliott's testimony was particularly emotional, as he described discovering the scene and recognizing the knife as one of his own survival knives that Benjamin had been fascinated with. He confirmed that Benjamin had told the detective about his close relationship with Megan, and that stabbing her didn't mesh with anything he believed in. He added that the whole experience felt like a realistic nightmare, until waking up above Megan's bed. Kathy Elliott's testimony focused on demonstrating the twins' close relationship and the absence of any motive. She tearfully told the jury that the 17-year-old twins got along well, and there was no reason Benjamin would want his sister dead. Her testimony was designed to reinforce the central defense argument. Without motive and with a loving sibling relationship, the only explanation for this tragedy was a medical episode. The battle over pillow evidence became the centerpiece of the entire trial. The prosecution's theory that Benjamin used the pillow to muffle screams was based on the absence of expected blood spatter patterns. They argued that the only thing soaked in blood was the pillow that Benjamin allegedly used to silence the victim. The defense strongly disputed this interpretation, maintaining that the pillow had been used in a genuine attempt to stop bleeding after Benjamin realized what had happened. Forensic experts from both sides presented conflicting analyses of blood patterns, with each side interpreting the same evidence to support their theory. The prosecution emphasized the suspicious absence of spray patterns, while the defense pointed to the lack of any definitive forensic evidence supporting the silencing theory. The question of pillow usage ultimately became symbolic of the larger battle between two completely different narratives of the same tragic event. Phone data evidence presented the prosecution with their strongest circumstantial case, but the defense team attempted to explain the findings within the context of parasomnia theory. They pointed to the 24-minute gap in phone activity as potentially corresponding with the sleepwalking episode. They also argued that post-incident actions, calling emergency services, performing CPR, demonstrated genuine shock and a desperate attempt to save Megan rather than calculated cover-up efforts. Behavioral analysis became another major battleground. The prosecution focused on Benjamin's allegedly unnaturally calm demeanor during police interrogation, his discussion of SATs and college plans while his sister was dying, and his minimal emotional reaction when told Megan had died. They presented these behaviors as evidence of consciousness and possible psychopathy. The defense explanation for these behaviors centered on shock and dissociation responses commonly seen in trauma victims. They argued that Benjamin's attempts to avoid thinking about the tragedy, his focus on normal life plans, and his calm exterior were all consistent with normal variation in grief expression and psychological coping mechanisms. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, both sides prepared to make their final appeals to the jury. The stakes could not have been higher. Benjamin faced a potential sentence of 5 to 99 years in prison if convicted, while acquittal would mean accepting that the tragic death of Megan Elliott had been the result of a rare medical phenomenon rather than a criminal act. The stage was set for the final confrontation between two fundamentally different views of human consciousness, criminal responsibility, and the nature of justice itself. On the morning of February 24, 2025, the atmosphere in the courtroom became particularly tense as both sides prepared to present their final arguments. This was the decisive moment where all the evidence, expert witness testimony, and emotional appeals would be distilled into final arguments aimed at convincing the jury about each side's version of the truth. Prosecutor Maroon Kutani stepped up to the podium with the confidence of a prosecutor who knew he had a strong circumstantial case, despite lacking a traditional motive. He began his closing argument by recreating the crime scene with vivid imagery designed to remind the jury of the human cost of this tragedy. Kutani described how Benjamin Elliott had walked into his sister's room with the exact knife he had acquired and stabbed her in the neck twice with precision, inconsistent with the random actions of a sleepwalker. Kutani's central argument focused on the absence of blood spatter evidence that the prosecution had interpreted as proof of premeditation. He dramatically declared that there was no blood spraying in the room because the only thing soaked in blood was the pillow that Benjamin had used to muffle Megan's screams. This imagery of a young girl's final moments being silenced by her own brother was designed to create an emotional impact that could override any scientific doubts in the minds of jurors. Kutani also methodically walked through the phone data evidence, emphasizing the timeline that showed Benjamin active on his device just minutes before the alleged sleepwalking episode. He pointed to the fact that Benjamin had been conscious enough to turn off his school alarm, navigate from room to room, and later call emergency services with a coherent explanation. The prosecution argued that the level of consciousness required for these actions was simply incompatible with medical claims about a sleepwalking state. The prosecutor concluded with a powerful statement about premeditation. "While I didn't give you motive, I did give you premeditation. It's not a coincidence that the knife he got the night before is the same knife he used to kill his sister." This was a summary statement designed to leave the jury with a clear interpretation of the evidence the prosecution had presented. The defense team, facing an uphill battle against compelling circumstantial evidence, structured their closing arguments around two central themes: the scientific credibility of the sleepwalking defense and the inconsistency of the prosecution's theory with Benjamin's post-incident behavior. Carrie Hart, lead defense counsel, began by addressing the fundamental question the jury had to answer. If Benjamin had truly consciously murdered his sister, why did he immediately call for help rather than attempt to cover up the crime? Hart methodically walked through the timeline of events, emphasizing that if Benjamin had been trying to conceal a criminal act, he wouldn't have called 911, wouldn't have performed CPR in a desperate attempt to save Megan, and wouldn't have cooperated fully with law enforcement. The defense argued that these actions only made sense in the context of someone who was genuinely horrified by what had happened and desperately trying to undo the tragedy. Wes Rucker took over to address the scientific aspects of the defense, reiterating Dr. Simmons's testimony about the perfect storm conditions that could lead to a violent parasomnia episode. He emphasized that this was not a creative legal strategy or desperate attempt to get Benjamin off, but a legitimate medical explanation supported by extensive research and clinical evidence. Rucker particularly focused on challenging the jury not to convict a young man based purely on how he appeared during interrogation or how he processed grief. He reminded jurors that people react differently to trauma, and that the absence of expected emotional responses didn't constitute proof of guilt. The defense urged the jury to focus on scientific evidence rather than emotional reactions to tragic circumstances. The most powerful moment of the defense closing came when Rucker directly addressed the question of motive. He asked the jury to consider, how could a kid who cherishes his sister, who loves her, protects her, how could someone commit a crime that heinous without a reasonable explanation? The defense argued that the only reasonable explanation, given the complete absence of any conflict between the siblings and overwhelming evidence of their close relationship, was the medical episode that this tragedy represented. When closing arguments concluded, Judge Danilo Lacayo provided detailed instructions to the jury about the law applicable to this case. Jurors were told that they must find Benjamin guilty beyond reasonable doubt of intentionally causing Megan's death. They were also instructed on how to evaluate expert testimony and scientific evidence, and about the importance of distinguishing between possibility and probability in their deliberations. 12 jurors, Bill Price, Wesley Scott, Carlos Fidalgo, and 9 others, retired to the deliberation room at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This room, with its simple conference table and uncomfortable chairs, became the setting for one of the most difficult decisions these people would ever have to make. They carried with them the weight of scientific uncertainty, emotional tragedy, and the knowledge that their decision would determine the fate of a young man and provide some form of closure for a grieving family. The deliberation process proved exceptionally challenging, with jurors struggling to reconcile compelling scientific testimony from both sides with their own understanding of human behavior and criminal responsibility. According to later interviews with some jurors, the discussion was intense and emotional, with some members initially leaning toward accepting the sleepwalking defense, while others remained convinced of Benjamin's conscious guilt. Key sticking points in deliberation included interpretation of the phone data, evaluation of conflicting expert testimony, and the question of whether reasonable doubt existed given the scientific possibilities presented by the defense. Some jurors were particularly troubled by the absence of a clear motive, while others focused on circumstantial evidence suggesting consciousness and planning. After 5 hours of careful deliberation, including review of key evidence and multiple votes, the jury reached a unanimous decision. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they informed the bailiff that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom quickly filled with family members, media representatives, legal professionals, and community members who had been following the case closely. When the jury foreman announced the guilty verdict, the reaction in the courtroom was mixed. Michael and Katy Elliott, despite years of preparation for this possibility, appeared devastated by the confirmation that their son would face significant prison time. Benjamin himself showed minimal reaction, maintaining the composure that had characterized his demeanor throughout the proceedings. However, a remarkable aspect of the verdict was the request that the jury submitted to the judge for leniency in sentencing. This unusual step suggested that while jurors believed the prosecution had met the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt, they remained troubled by aspects of the case and wanted to see mercy shown in the punishment phase. This indication of internal conflict among jurors provided insight into the difficulty of their decision-making process. Judge Lacayo dismissed the jury with thanks for their service and announced that he would handle the punishment phase the following day. Under Texas law, murder carries a sentence range from 5 to 99 years in prison, giving the judge significant discretion in determining appropriate punishment for Benjamin's specific circumstances. The sentencing hearing on February 25th became an emotionally charged proceeding, focused on the question of what constitutes appropriate punishment for a crime committed under such ambiguous circumstances. The prosecution team, led by Megan Long, requested a sentence of no less than 40 years in prison, arguing that the severity of the crime and impact on the family demanded a substantial incarceration period. Family impact statements provided the most emotional moments of the sentencing hearing. Michael and Katy Elliott, struggling with the incomprehensible loss of one child and impending incarceration of another, delivered tearful testimony about the impact of the tragedy on their lives. They described the daily struggle of living with grief, public scrutiny, and ongoing questions about what really happened that night. Katy Elliott's statement was particularly moving when she described losing both children, Megan through death and Benjamin through imprisonment. She emphasized that while they supported Benjamin and believed in his innocence of conscious wrongdoing, they also mourned deeply for Megan and understood that some form of accountability was necessary. Benjamin himself was given the opportunity to address the court, and his statement provided insight into his psychological state years after the tragedy. He maintained his innocence of intentional wrongdoing while acknowledging the devastating impact of his actions on the family. He expressed deep sorrow for the loss of Megan and emphasized that no day passed when he didn't wish things had been different. The most poignant moment of Benjamin's statement came when he addressed the inconsistency in the jury's verdict and request for leniency. He asked a pointed question. "If you believe that I crept into my sister's bedroom and murdered her while she was asleep, why would you possibly want leniency for that person? That person is horrible. Are you that person?" "No, I'm not that person." This statement highlighted the fundamental tension in the case. The disconnect between the legal finding of guilt and underlying uncertainty about Benjamin's moral culpability that had troubled the jury enough to request mercy. The question he posed went to the heart of larger issues about consciousness, intent, and the appropriate limits of criminal responsibility. Judge Lacayo, faced with a difficult balancing act between competing considerations, ultimately decided on a sentence of 15 years in prison. This decision reflected several factors: the jury's explicit request for leniency, Benjamin's age at the time of the offense, his lack of criminal history, his behavior while on bond, and the unusual circumstances of the case. Under Texas law, Benjamin would be eligible for parole consideration after serving half of his sentence, meaning potential release after 7.5 years. The sentence was generally viewed as a compromise attempting to balance the various interests involved. The prosecution, while disappointed with a length considerably shorter than requested, noted that substantial prison time had been imposed. The defense, though hoping for an even shorter sentence, acknowledged that given the severity of the charge, 15 years represented recognition of the complex circumstances surrounding the crime. Reaction from expert witnesses who had testified revealed ongoing divisions in the scientific community about the case. Dr. Gerald Simmons expressed disappointment with the verdict, stating his belief that the jury had gotten it wrong. He maintained that scientific evidence clearly supported the sleepwalking explanation, and that the conviction represented a miscarriage of justice based on misunderstanding of medical realities about parasomnia. Conversely, prosecution experts maintained that the verdict vindicated their analysis of the evidence. Dr. Mark Pressman noted that the jury's careful deliberation and ultimate conclusion suggested that scientific claims about sleepwalking had been appropriately scrutinized and found insufficient to overcome circumstantial evidence of consciousness and planning. Legal community response to the case was mixed, with some attorneys viewing the verdict as an appropriate application of legal standards in the face of scientific uncertainty, while others expressed concern about the precedent being set for future sleepwalking defenses. The case highlighted ongoing tensions between advancing medical knowledge about consciousness and traditional legal frameworks for determining criminal responsibility. Media coverage of the verdict and sentencing brought national attention to broader issues surrounding sleep disorders and criminal law. CBS's 48 Hours program, in an episode titled "The Boy Who Killed His Twin," provided a comprehensive examination of the case that reached millions of viewers and sparked widespread public discussion about parasomnia, expert testimony, and the limits of scientific knowledge in legal proceedings. Public reaction to the case revealed deep divisions in opinion about the appropriate outcome. Some viewed Benjamin as a victim of a medical condition who deserved treatment rather than punishment, while others saw the verdict as a necessary affirmation that actions have consequences regardless of alleged mental state during their commission. The debate extended beyond legal circles into medical communities, ethics forums, and general public discourse. The impact on the Elliott family has been profound and lasting. Michael and Kathy Elliott continue to live with the dual tragedy of losing Megan and seeing Benjamin incarcerated. They have become reluctant advocates for awareness about sleep disorders while also dealing with ongoing grief and public scrutiny of their family situation. Their experience highlights the collateral damage that complex criminal cases can inflict on families, regardless of legal outcomes. Benjamin Elliott, now serving his sentence in a Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility, maintains his innocence of conscious wrongdoing while acknowledging the devastating impact of his actions. He has participated in sleep disorder treatment programs and has been a model prisoner, suggesting that whatever happened that night, he does not represent an ongoing danger to public safety that incarceration is primarily meant to address. The case has contributed significantly to ongoing research about violent parasomnias and their legal implications. Medical researchers have cited the Elliott case in studies examining the relationship between sleep disorders and aggressive behavior, while legal scholars have analyzed the case as an example of the challenges facing courts when scientific evidence conflicts with traditional approaches to criminal responsibility. Looking forward, the Elliott case will likely be remembered as a watershed moment in the intersection of sleep medicine and criminal law. It demonstrates both the potential and limitations of scientific evidence in legal proceedings, highlighting the need for continued research into consciousness, sleep disorders, and their implications for how society determines guilt and innocence in complex cases. The legacy of Megan Elliott, the 17-year-old girl with artistic talent and a creative worldview, remains central to understanding the broader meaning of this tragedy. Her death represents not only a personal loss to her family, but also a reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable ways that medical conditions can intersect with human tragedy. As Benjamin Elliott serves his sentence with the possibility of parole in 2032, the questions raised by his case continue to challenge legal and medical communities. Whether he was the perpetrator of a conscious crime or the victim of a rare medical phenomenon may never be definitively answered, but his case has undeniably advanced important conversations about consciousness, responsibility, and justice in modern society. The ultimate truth about what happened in the early morning hours of September 29, 2021, may remain forever locked in the mysteries of human consciousness and sleep. But the legacy of the case, in its contributions to legal precedent, medical research, and public understanding of the complex relationship between mind and moral responsibility, ensures that the tragedy of the Elliott twins will continue to inform and influence how society grapples with these fundamental questions about human nature and justice.